Good morning. This is Edward J. Marolda. I'm speaking today about the Easter Offensive and the U.S. Navy's involvement in that. To give you some background, I was the acting director of naval history when I retired in 2008. Before that, the senior historian of the Navy. And I worked since December of 1971 at the Naval Historical Center, now Naval History and Heritage Command. I'm the author of 18 or 19 publications at this point, and I've been very closely associated with naval history for my entire academic career. 2022 marks the 50th anniversary of one of the Vietnam War's most memorable events, perhaps second only to the Tet Offensive of 1968. The opening phase of the Nguyen Way Offensive, that's what North Vietnam referred to it as, and to us it's the Easter Offensive, broke out on the 30th of March 1972. People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN forces, smashed across the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam at the 17th parallel. There were other attacks that happened in weeks following the 30 March initial attack in Military Region 1. These other attacks took place north of Saigon in Military Region 3 and the Central Highlands of South Vietnam in Military Region 2. Some 14 PAVN divisions armed with main battle tanks, T-54 main battle tanks, P-76 armored personnel carriers, 130 millimeter artillery pieces, and SA-7 handheld surface-to-air missiles. This was not your peasant army of past years in the Vietnam War. They were not in black pajamas with conical hats. These were fully trained, highly armed, and motivated North Vietnamese regular troops, like any you would see in a conventional army of the late 20th century. Why did North Vietnam launch the Easter Offensive? Well, first of all, Richard Nixon came into office in November of 1968, and what he said fairly soon after coming in was, I am going to get U.S. troops out of Vietnam. The Vietnamese should carry on their own fight. But we don't want to leave them in the lurch. They've been our allies, and we want to arm them so they can carry on the fight. This is called the Vietnamization program that he pushed. The program got a black eye in 1971 when the Army of Vietnam, ARVN, in fact its most elite forces, moved into southern Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is Operation Lam Son 719. Well, it didn't go well, and the North Vietnamese responded heavily, and the South Vietnamese were forced to leave Laos sooner than later, and they had casualties as high as 50%. So it was not a good day for the South Vietnamese, not a good day for the Vietnamization program. Well, one effect this had was that Le Duan, who was the successor to Ho Chi Minh, who had died in 1969, Le Duan decided, I'm going to go for broke in 1972. What were his goals? Well, his goals were, number one, to destroy the armed forces of South Vietnam. The second was to overturn and get rid of the South Vietnamese government, which they referred to as the puppet American government. And three, to achieve a victory over the United States, in fact, humiliate the United States by pushing us out of Vietnam. And before pressure from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China kicked in, those two countries had other fish to fry in 1972 that didn't necessarily support the Vietnamese continuation of the war. So Le Duan wanted to strike quickly and have this positive result happen before the negative things happen. President Richard Nixon's response to the invasion was immediate and forceful. He would have no defeat on his watch. And we had another political aspect as well. The November presidential election was coming up. He did not want to appear weak and give his opponents any leg to stand on. He also wanted to honor his pledge to Nguyen Van Thieu, who was the president of the Republic of Vietnam, that the United States would provide air and naval support if, as the North Vietnamese did, they came charging across the DMZ. There was another larger global issue at stake here. Richard Nixon really wanted to impress the Soviets and the Chinese that the United States and its military power would still count heavily in the post-Vietnam period. Nixon and Henry Kissinger had gone to China in February of 1972, and we were making nice with Mao Zedong and company at that point. And also there was a meeting scheduled for May in Moscow, in which we would talk with the Soviets about strategic arms limitations. So very important things for the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese. Nixon ordered a massive deployment of Naval and Air Forces to the region, including by 15 May, 6 aircraft carriers operating in the Gulf of Tonkin or close by, an unprecedented number of carriers at one time during the entire war. Also, over 100 warships of the 7th Fleet were operating with the carriers. The Air Force beefed up its B-52 force in Thailand and on the island of Guam to the extent that they had 210 of these heavy bombers available for operations. The focus of my presentation, this is all preview or context, to put it in context, but the focus of my presentation is the vital contribution of U.S. sea power to the defeat of the Easter Offensive and for the success of the Linebacker campaigns that followed the Easter Offensive, actually during the Easter Offensive. After 30 March, we're going back to the initial opening, the 30th of March and the weeks following, the North Vietnamese Army in Military Region 1 dealt the South Vietnamese a very tough time. In fact, they virtually destroyed the 3rd ARVN Infantry Division, one of the newest and greenest of the South Vietnamese Army divisions. And they pushed on south toward Quang Tri City and Hue, the old imperial capital of Hue. Only a small number of American advisors were then in country. There were no main force, regular combat forces of the United States. In the early weeks, and this is a critical period when the enemy is massing and really going for broke, this is when the 7th Fleet sea power really paid its dues. It was the first major effort by U.S. forces to counteract the enemy offensive. Some 20 destroyers of the 7th Fleet and the 7th Fleet's Gunfire support unit came into the fray. They were right offshore, and they poured fire into the enemy's tank columns proceeding down the main route, QL1 or Route 1, if you will, right along the coast and within range of the destroyer's about 12-mile limit gunfire. This sounds familiar to contemporary listeners. It probably is. We've seen Russian columns in the invasion of Ukraine unsupported by infantry. Not a good course to take when you're in that situation. Well, the same applied to the North Vietnamese. Their tanks, their armored PT-76s were advancing without infantry support, and it didn't do them well. The fleet was really taking out one armored vehicle after the other. This is a geographically narrow area of Vietnam between the mountains and the sea, so it was a good shooting region for Navy gunfire. John Ripley, Captain John Ripley, one of the few advisors on the scene, Marine captain, he earned the Navy Cross, in fact, for destroying a critical bridge over the Qua Viet River. But he also remarked, he gave credit for the Navy for its accurate and timely gunfire, and he really said it helped to slow the enemy advance in MR1 at that point. By the 19th of May, the 7th Fleet had fired 83,000 rounds in support of ARVN forces fighting ashore. And in the 3rd week of April, good weather returned. Previously, it had been the northeast monsoon with heavy rain, lots of low clouds, and not good flying weather. Well, that changed after the third week of April. And at that point, aircraft squadrons from Coral Sea, Hancock, and Kitty Hawk joined the fray. These carrier squadrons during this period executed some 2,000 tactical sorties. 2,000 compared with the Air Force's 1,900. This is often the case where the Navy is usually the first on the spot before the Air Force can get airfields stocked up with planes flying in from everywhere. And so the Navy put in a good show at this point. The Quang Tri City did fall to the enemy on the 1st of May. They just kept on rolling. But ARVN, with the help of U.S. Naval Forces, the ARVN, in hard fighting by ARVN, they were able to stabilize the front at the Mekong River just south of Quang Tri City. So it was, things were slowing down for the enemy. Nixon announced at this point that Hanoi's aggression really canceled or made moot Lyndon Johnson's ending of bombing in North Vietnam on the 31st of October, 1968. Said all bets are off now. It's on. The game is on. He announced Operation Freedom Train on the 5th of April, and at that point, U.S. Air and Naval Forces, Air Force, Navy forces, started hitting targets in North Vietnam that they had not done since 1968. 7 Fleet cruisers and destroyers bombarded enemy surface-to-air missile sites, anti-aircraft sites, bridges, and WIBLICs, waterborne logistics craft. Those were small boats or some larger boats, junks that were working along the coast and into the river mouths and whatnot in the process of moving supplies south to aid the fighting in South Vietnam. On the 14th of April, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Thomas A. Hinman Moore, by the way, one of the 5 admirals that I treat in my recently published book, Admirals Under Fire of the U.S. Navy and the Vietnam War. Admiral Moore on the 14th said, "I'm opening up the entire coast of North Vietnam to naval gunfire." Now this was an innovation because during Rolling Thunder, President Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara had really constrained what the surface Navy could do. Most of the operations had to be below the 20th parallel. Striking targets around Haiphong, the major port of Vietnam, North Vietnam, was verboten at that point. The April to September period, the Surface Action Group, the cruisers and destroyers, fired 111,000 rounds at shore targets and sank some 200 coastal craft trying to make their way south with supplies. The 27th of August saw the last naval battle of the Vietnam War. Newport News and 3 other ships bombarded targets on the Do San Peninsula. This is the very doorstep of Haiphong. They bombarded the targets. It's a nighttime operation. They headed out to sea and headed toward, they're in the vicinity of Bac Long V, or Norway Island. And 3 Soviet-made P-6 motor torpedo boats came out to attack them that night. Well, it didn't work out well for the enemy. We sank 2 of the 3 boats. You may remember that in 1966, another 3 motor torpedo boats came out to attack the fleet. These are the same 3 that had attacked Maddox in August of 1964. Those 3 boats were sunk as well. So 2 in August of 72, 3, and 1 more at the end of the war, a Komar missile boat, a Soviet-made missile boat that was armed with Styx missiles, something that we were concerned about throughout the war, finally made their appearance. 3 of them were coming into northern Vietnam. We sank 1 of them, the other 2 went into hiding, and the war ended. So this was the contribution by Naval Air and Naval Surface Forces to destroying the North Vietnamese Navy. Enemy counter-battery fire sometimes killed and wounded American sailors. But this was not a common occurrence. The enemy's coastal defense forces, their aim was terrible. primarily because they were operating field artillery pieces, Army artillery pieces, not prepared, not trained for engaging warships that are on the move. So you see many occasions where shells are falling around the ships, and the ships just either moved away or fired back, but it was not a major deterrent to the U.S. Navy. One example of this occurring was the 23rd of May, 1972, Vice Admiral James L. Holloway III, who became commander of 7th Fleet that day, and he's one of the other admirals in my Admirals Under Fire book. He took command on Oklahoma City, his flagship. Well, it was straddled by gunfire from the North Vietnamese shore. They simply moved away in safer waters and carried on with the ceremony. The thing to take away from this is, despite the enemy killing sailors and wounding sailors on occasion, at no time during the war did the enemy sink a U.S. Navy warship. Frustrated perhaps by this lack of success, maritime success, on the 19th of April, Hanoi sent 2 or 3, the sources disagree on this, MiG-17s out to strike at the fleet. One of the MiGs dropped a 550-pound bomb on the aft gun turret of destroyer Higbee. The turret was unoccupied, so it didn't do much. It destroyed the turret, but that was it, and wounded 4 sailors. But for this so-called victory, some call this the Battle of Dong Hoi, which to me seems grandiose. But the enemy paid with the loss of one of the MiGs to a Terrier surface-to-air missile fired by guided missile cruiser Sterett. Even as the fleet executed operations in North Vietnam, it continued to provide support for the battle in Military Region 1. In what might be called, and I call them mini Inchons, Marine helicopters from amphibious assault ship Okinawa of Task Force 76, the amphibious task force of the fleet, put South Vietnamese Marines behind enemy lines, helicopter lift of these forces behind enemy lines. And at the same time, or shortly thereafter, Duluth, LPD Duluth, and other amphibious ships landed South Vietnamese Marines over the beach, a classical amphibious operation. During May, June, and July, U.S. and South Vietnamese amphibious forces launched 5 major operations and a couple of feints to distract the enemy in this region just to the east of Quang Tri City. Really kept the enemy off balance in Military Region 1, such that with the hard fighting of the South Vietnamese Marines and airborne troops, by September they had recaptured Quang Tri City and they established a line of the Qua Viet River just south of the DMZ. Underway replenishment needs to be mentioned here because the logistic support force of the 7th Fleet, Task Force 73, kept the fleet operating off Vietnam in 72 as it had throughout the war. And these logistic support ships, oilers, ammunition ships, repair ships, they satisfy as much as 95 or 97% of the fuel and ammunition and other needs of the fleet. In a Vietnam War innovation, CH-46 helicopters, C-Knight helicopters, did something called vertical replenishment, where the use of slings and cargo nets, they would deploy or deliver supplies to the fantails of ships underway in the Gulf of Tonkin. There was no need for the warships of the 7th Fleet to go back to Subic Bay or Japan or Okinawa to refurbish with fuel and ammunition and the other supplies. It was brought to them. This was critical. Another powerful offensive sea power asset was mine warfare. Between 0859 and 0901, a few minutes, on 9 May 1972, 7 Navy A7 Corsairs and 6 Marine A6 Intruders, both flying from Coral Sea, seeded 36 Mark 52 magnetic mines in the sea approaches to Haiphong. This had been called for years and years and years, and it finally took place within a few seconds, a few minutes, if you will, without cost. and it shut down the port of Haiphong for the rest of the war. And some of the ships got out before the mines were activated, but most were stayed stuck in port, and it really ruled out use of that port for the remainder of the war. As I said, that was something that had been called for by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, by the Navy for sure, throughout the early part of the war. The Johnson administration said, no way, it'll get the Soviets mad. They were against it. In Operation Pocket Money, during the rest of the war, after the 9 May sieging of Haiphong, the fleet sowed more than 11,700 mines along the coast, in the river mouths, in the rivers, and really made it difficult for the enemy to use the sea for any purpose. The mining offensive also limited the supplies that could get into North Vietnam. It was totally reliant at this point on the land route from China, the railroads and the roads. Well, of course, we redoubled efforts to hit those particular resources. And it had a dramatic effect. Exports from China to North Vietnam went from 160,000 tons a month to 30,000 tons. This is significant. As the old expression goes, victory has many fathers. And I think a good example of that is, who was the greatest champion of the mining of Haiphong? Admiral Thomas H. Moore or Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt Jr., who was then the Chief of Naval Operations? Well, Moore had served on a staff of a Royal Navy group that was doing mine warfare preparations in World War II. After the war, Moore took part in the Strategic Bombing Survey with a focus again on mining. In his commands, and he was commanding of everything, he commanded 7 fleets, Pacific Fleet, Atlantic Fleet, Chief of Naval Operations, and later on Chairman of Joint Chiefs. He had consistently called for mining of North Vietnam, which was rejected by Washington. Well, finally, President Nixon said, okay, you've been calling for this, it's yours. Go for it. And he took Moore, of course it was very successful, Moore took sole credit from that point on for the mining operation. But as I said, victory has many fathers. Admiral Zumwalt had also long called for mining, and as the Chief of Naval Operations, his staff, the mine warfare staff, had all the plans. They updated them periodically, so he had to. And both Zumwalt and Moore worked for weeks during this period before the actual mining to prepare the plan. So they worked together. Really putting a cap to that too, Lieutenant Commander Roberta Hazard, later Rear Admiral Roberta Hazard, was on Zumwalt's staff, and she remembered both Moore and Zumwalt on their hands and knees on the floor of the Pentagon office poring over charts and maps. So they clearly both worked on the mine warfare plan. On the 10th of May, the 7th Fleet unleashed devastating firepower in the first day of Linebacker 1, the Linebacker 1 campaign. What was the goal? To limit Hanoi's ability to wage the war in the South, continue waging the war, and to support that in North Vietnam as well. The 10th of May, that same day, there was a multi-plane strike on targets in North Vietnam, on Haiphong, Hai which is between Hanoi and Haiphong, on the ports Hon Gai and Cam Pha up toward the Chinese border. Massive strikes. The Air Force at the same time was attacking the Paul Doomer Bridge in Hanoi. This was the major effort against North Vietnam. They had to respond. They didn't often send up their MiGs to contest with the Americans because their MiGs were a precious commodity. But they did this time. They launched their MiGs and they paid a heavy price for that response. Between 1300 and 1306, 6 minutes, U.S. Navy F-4 Phantom shot down 6 MiG-17s. And during the entire day, the Air Force and the Navy claimed 11 MiGs. This was a big day for the Americans. The F-4 pilot Randy Cunningham and his backseater, Willie Driscoll, finally got their 5th MiG of the war, making them the Navy's only aces of the war and the first aces of the war. Another thing that they benefited from was the training at the Top Gun School at the Miramar Naval Air Station in California. Top Gun School, as most people know after having seen the movie, was set up after the poor performance, not as great performance during Rolling Thunder. The ratio of victories to losses was like 2-1, UNSAT. During 1972, that ratio became 13-1, much more to our liking. So the Top Gun training was a big part of that. Cunningham and Driscoll, but others also benefited from that training. Another key to fighter success was the assistance by the PIRAS ships. PIRAS, not pirates, PIRAS, a Positive Identification Radar Advisory Zone. This was an area southeast of Haiphong, where Navy guided missile cruisers armed with the most advanced radars, communications gear, and highly trained and motivated senior enlisted sailors really were so important to finding when the MiGs were lifting off from their airfields, where they were going, and could direct our Navy and Air Force fighters to go get them. Very successful. Just one example of that success, Chicago, guided missile cruiser Chicago's Senior Chief Radar Man Larry Nowell earned the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. He helped the Navy and the Air Force shoot down 12 MiGs during this period. The carrier strikes benefited from another Vietnam innovation. Now, this had occurred earlier in Rolling Thunder, but it was in the early stages. But at this point, it was very critical to performance. Precision-guided munitions, PGMs, came into their own in 1972. The Navy had the Walleye TV guided bomb, and the Air Force had laser-guided bombs, both of which did yeoman work in taking out all but a few of the bridges in North Vietnam, especially those between the Tonkin Delta and the border with China. One example of that success occurred on the 6th of October when Ace487 Corsairs, one of which was piloted by a later full four-star Admiral Snuffy Smith, who was our NATO commander in the 1990s. He and the three other crews, and they had two walleyes that impacted on the Tan Hoa Bridge, called the Dragon's Jaw Bridge by the North Vietnamese. Now, that bridge had been impervious to U.S. Air Force and Navy strikes throughout the war. At one point, we drop a span, but they quickly repair it. Well, this strike on the 6th of October finally put the bridge out of commission, and other actions kept it from being repaired by the end of the war. By the early fall, Task Force 77 was executing 4,700 attack sorties a month. On the 18th of December, after negotiations had failed earlier with Hanoi, they backtracked as we did. Nixon ordered Linebacker 2, the Linebacker 2 campaign, with heavy reliance on B-52 bomber strikes and tactical airstrikes. President Nixon told Admiral Moore, his Joint Chiefs, and his primary military advisor. Nixon went to Moore all the time for his advice. He did not go to the Joint Chiefs, the members of the Joint Chiefs, because he didn't like most of them. He did not like General Westmoreland. He thought he had screwed up earlier in the war. He did not like Creighton Abrams, who he thought screwed up with the Lamson 719 operation. And he certainly didn't like Admiral Zumwalt, whom the very conservative, politically and socially conservative president, he considered Zumwalt a progressive radical who was ruining his Navy, in which he had served in World War II. So Moore designed, when Nixon said, okay, do it or I'll consider you responsible, Moore then designed a campaign that, number one, was to inflict maximum damage on the enemy's war-making capability, and number two, convince the North Vietnamese leaders and the population of Hanoi and the Tonkin Delta that Nixon meant business. He was not going to quit until he got what he wanted. After a maximum effort attack on the 28th of December with B-52s and attack air, the North Vietnamese finally said, okay, we're willing to talk. And the end result was the Paris Agreement on the 27th of January, 1973. Sea power, in my view, was critical to Allied success in 5 specific areas. Air operations, number 1. It helped defeat the offensive thrusts, enemy's offensive thrusts throughout South Vietnam. Navy carrier planes helped out with the fight north of Saigon and also in the Central Highlands. Air operations limited the North Vietnamese ability to continue supplying their forces in South Vietnam. It seriously degraded the enemy's air and naval defenses, and it put heavy military pressure and psychological pressure on Hanoi to get them to negotiate seriously. 2, mining operations. It shut down North Vietnam's ports. It increased the difficulty of moving supplies along the coast and through the southern panhandle of North Vietnam. And it increased the difficulty and the cost of bringing in war materials from China. 3, defeat of the Easter Offensive in Military Region 1. The cruiser-destroyer forces, the amphibious forces, and the carrier forces enabled the South Vietnamese Marines and the airborne to blunt the enemy's drive on Hue and then execute a successful counterattack that liberated Quang Tri City. 4, naval bombardment of North Vietnam. It put heavy pressure on the enemy's logistic movements in the Panhandle and brought firepower to bear on the enemy's air and sea defenses around the critical area of Haiphong. 5, neutralization of the North Vietnamese Navy. This occurred, I mentioned the August 1972 sinking of 2 P-6s and the earlier one sinking of 3 P-4s. But throughout the war, we were taking out all manner of boats, both combat boats and supply boats, all on the coast, in port, and wherever we could find them. It was not a safe thing for the North Vietnamese to be operating at sea at any point. In conclusion, sea power was absolutely critical to 1, defeat of the enemy offensive in South Vietnam, and 2, the Linebacker campaign in North Vietnam, and 3, the effort to bring Hanoi to the peace table. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to our April 2022 Second Saturday show, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive, also known as Dien Yit Son Hea. Thanks to Quang Pho, my friend Quang Pho, for that interpretation. Thank you, Dr. Marolda, for your thorough insights opening this program. Thank you also for your remarkable book, which is a must-read, Admirals Under Fire, the U.S. Navy and the Vietnam War, where you focus on our leadership from Admiral Harry Don Felt, U.S. Grant Sharp, Thomas H. Moorer, Elmo R. Zumwalt, and James L. Holloway III. Other important names are mentioned, such as Thomas B. Hayward, Jack McCain, and the administrations of Presidents Johnson and Nixon. When coupled together, the events of the Easter Offensive and the U.S. Navy response, the powerful response, with the decision logic of the aforementioned presidential, state, and defense departments' leadership during the Cold War, in some ways it becomes a real historic head-scratcher. Regardless, the history is what we're focusing on, and we have a great panel to discuss it. We begin with BJ Penn and Snuffy Smith, 2 veterans of this offensive, from their purchase of their Ace6 Avenger and A7 Corsair. The tactics, techniques, and procedures used in the spring-summer offensive were drastically different than in the earlier portions of the war. And I want to remind you, if you like our content, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and the bell to receive notification of our future content. Join our foundation and be a member. Let's get started. The first questions, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I want to repeat them for how we edit the program going forward, go to the Honorable BJ Penn and Admiral Snuffy Smith. And beginning with Admiral Smith, if you could take us through the journey that you took collaboratively with BJ Penn on the USS Saratoga, a vessel you would later command. What do you remember most about the Easter offensive? And repeat again, what was the collective morale of your squadron mates who were effectively turned around, brought into the Pacific theater from the Mediterranean, and given the gloves-off approach to your new air tasking orders?
Well, Sonny, let me correct you. First of all, we were on the USS America, the greatest carrier.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, America. I apologize.
That's all right. I just want to make sure that's the one I commanded.
That's right.
Buddy and I had a great time.
Yeah.
But we were all set to go on a med cruise, as I think I said earlier, and we sort of sniffed that the tempo of operations in Vietnam was picking up big time. And we heard about the mining, and the next thing we knew, we were heading east instead of west, or west instead of east. We got over there, and the mood of the squadron primarily was felt mostly among those of us who had been there once or twice before, where we had been hamstrung in terms of what targets we could hit, how we could hit them, where they were located, all the rules of engagement. It just didn't make any sense at all. And it appeared that they were taking the gloves off. And if we were going to go stick our nose in harm's way, at least we might be able to do something worthwhile. So it gave us a sense of being able to do something that we had done before.
Yes, sir. And if I may ask, some of the audience is having a trouble hearing you a little bit. If you could just try to come in a little bit louder. BJ, what are your thoughts? How do you please pile on top of Admiral Smith?
This was my second cruise. My first cruise was on the Shangri-La, and then went back, transitioned to the new EA-6B Prowler, which was the a new electronic aircraft that it really performed remarkably well. We did part of the Alpha Val, then we went real world in Vietnam. The morale of the troops, first cruise compared to the second cruise, was remarkable. The air wing they were going to war, they were doing the things they were trained to do, which is what we all want to do. I mean, war is terrible, but you train for the mission, you fly the mission, you do it. And one of the things we're together now at a convention of all things, and about half the guys here were Vietnam aviators. I would say at least what, half?
Yeah.
The Golden Eagles here in Lansdowne, Virginia, and the stories you should hear standing around the bar are remarkable. But the cruise, it was a long cruise. Admiral Smith was, we were both lieutenant commanders, but he was the strike leader of strike leaders. And I know we went on for the briefs, and quite often the admiral would come into the brief and be right there with you, right in the front row.
Well, that was a big coolie, the Admiral Jack Christensen, one of the greatest leaders that we've ever had. And he, cigar chomping, whiskey drinking guy, I loved him. He was plain spoken and right in your face. And he gave us all the latitude we could under the rules of engagement. But the beauty of Admiral Christensen, he wanted to talk to the pilots. What can you do and what can't you do? And don't tell me you can do something that you can't do, because I don't want to put you in harm's way unless you can accomplish the mission. That's what I would say about him. The morale of the troops was considerably improved over the previous two cruises I made, because we were, like I said before, we were being told which direction to make run-ins, which a bridge is going this way, you had to go across this way because they don't want you. The rules of engagement, we don't want to take a chance on hitting a house over here or a dam over here, so you got to cross the least chance of hitting it, and the greatest chance of getting hit. I remember one strike I went on, the CAG told me, Smith, if you go above this line right here, we ain't coming to get you. They were serious about that.
Wow.
Thank you, sirs. I want to bring attention to BJ Penn's great sea story book, penned by Bob Ramsey, a shipmate of his. And I also want to say that for the first time in many of our second Saturdays, we have basically squadron mates who flew the similar missions. And so when we talk about especially the big missions, BJ Penn and Snuffy Smith were aligned together in these stories that I know you'll enjoy hearing in a few minutes. Dr. Miralda, again, covered extensively in your book, Admirals Under Fire. Can you describe the relationship or interactions during this time between CJCS Moore and President Nixon, Secretary of Defense Laird, and US MACV General Creighton Abrams? This is a pretty important part of our story.
Thank you, Sonny, for that kind introduction and introducing my book as well. It was a remarkable relationship between President Nixon and Admiral Moore. I had mentioned in my prepared remarks that the president really didn't have much truck with the members of the Joint Chiefs for various reasons. And there was another problem in the connection as well, and that was with the Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird. President Nixon really was at odds with Secretary Melvin Laird because of certain things. Number one was the shoot down of the EC-121 in 1969 didn't sit well with the way the Secretary of Defense had responded. He wasn't happy with Melvin Laird wanted to get U.S. troops out of Vietnam pretty much at any cost. I mean, he was just wanting to pack up and leave. Nixon had other fish to fry. He had other things on his agenda. And Admiral Moore ended up being, as was mentioned in the video, the primary military advisor to President Nixon. You might even say the only military advisor, but he had a lot of clout. And they were similar in terms of their philosophy toward life. They're both conservative politically, socially. They had no regard for hippies and the left wing and anti-war demonstrators. So they're very comfortable socially. And Nixon liked the fact that Admiral Moore would take an order and he would put together the plans and he would execute it. There wasn't a lot of back and forth. And this was recognized early on during the Cambodia incursion in 1970, when Moore stood in as the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Nixon liked the way he worked with the admiral. So he got the top job soon afterward. And and one thing was clear, Admiral Moore understood what President Nixon's overall strategy was, global strategy. And the fact that he really wanted to impress the Soviets and the Chinese that we're still a power to be reckoned with, even after the war and after the withdrawal. And so that did him very well. And as I mentioned and there were others who came a cropper with it. I mentioned General Westmoreland, who Nixon was not happy with his performance early in the war. His successor, Creighton Abrams, the same thing, especially after the Laos incursion, Lamson 719 went south. He really took Abrams to task for that. And Abrams was very much focused on use of the B-52s in South Vietnam in support of the ground operations. Well, Nixon and Moore understood the larger picture, that you needed to use the B-52s as well to impress the Chinese and the Russians about what we're doing in North Vietnam. So Moore understood the bigger picture and Creighton Abrams did not. So there was a problem there. But it was a long-lasting and remarkable relationship between Nixon and Moore.
Great, thank you so much. For Secretary Penn, BJ, with the successful naval gunfire support and other strike missions on anti-air facilities and sites, how long into the offensive was it when it was noticeable to you that the dynamics of your strike missions and risks had changed precipitously from pre-offensive missions? And Admiral Smith, jump on top of that after BJ.
To me, it was almost immediate. Just the aircraft, we stopped losing aircraft. The good thing is every time one of the EA-6Bs, a Prowler, was airborne, we did not lose an airplane on any of the strikes. And that was a good thing to know. And I think it gave all the pilots, all the crew confidence, to the point that we would not only cover the strikes on the America, we'd go over to the Midway and the other carriers in the Gulf and help them with their alpha strikes, with their major strikes. We still had planes going in, the A6s going in by themselves at night. You remember near the war, Gordy Nakagawa got shot down.
Yes, sir.
But either, and I don't know what happened, but either the B-52s were early or he was late or something happened with his schedule. And I think he did spend, less than a year in jail. But yeah, and Gordy was an A6 guy out of Whitby that I knew very well, a good friend. But it was a quite noticeable difference to me.
How about you, Snuffy? How about you, sir?
We love Buddy in the ES6B, I'll tell you that right now. It's hard to love a guy that's ugly. But I'll tell you that the ES6B was our hero, and we just didn't want to go across the beach without it. We had the Shrike missile, which was supposed to be magic, but it didn't do that much good. That was sort of after the fact. But I can't say that I noticed a difference because it's kind of hard to tell whether the 10 guns are shooting at you or 2. When they got a beat on you, they were still shooting, but they didn't shoot nearly as much, and they didn't have the tracking fire that they had before. You did pose a question earlier on about the difference in tactics. In our first cruise to Vietnam in 1966 or 7, I can't remember when, if you got a SAM shot at you, it was almost a sure thing you were going to die.
Yeah.
We were scared to death of them. And the immediate reaction was to go as low as you could go and just scoot down there and get down underneath it.
Yeah.
And the guys are going down there and they're getting shot down by a small arms fire. Doug Burns is a classic example, got shot down near Thin Rock by dodging his head, going down low and got nailed with small arms fire. With the third cruise I went over there, we were going in at 14,000 feet, which did 2 things for us. One, we kept our energy up because we were going a pretty good clip, and we were out of small arms fire averaging. Secondly, when we used to go in low, like 3,000 or 4,000 feet, that give us closer. We'd be closer to the ground, obviously. Rolling altitude was about 8,000 feet. So then you had to go in and climb up to 8,000 feet, and that was a pain in the butt. You just slow down and get up at the top and roll over, and that's when you're going to get nailed. So going in at 14,000 feet and then dropping and being out and gone no lower than 2,500 feet, preferably 3,500 feet, that was a major benefit in us not losing as many aircraft in the latter part of the war as we did in the first part of the war.
Thank you very much. A member of our foundation, Commander Sean Walsh, asks and states that one of his former bosses was a gunnery assistant on the Richard S. Edwards, a Forrest Sherman class destroyer in the conflict. And he related that they went in along with other ships and provided NGFS, naval gunfire support, while the mining was going on. And we'll talk more about what the aviation contribution to the mining was, which was substantial, if not definitive. But he assumed that this was intended as a distraction. Can you comment on whether you thought it was a distraction or you thought it was essential? Did they have specific targets? And Admiralda, you can jump in on this one as well, please.
As far as the mining is concerned, I don't recall being supported by naval gunfire support, but clearly any support you get against firing flak sites is something that you'd be thankful for, because those guys were worried about themselves as well as trying to shoot you down. It's just a matter of fact. Now,
well, if I could jump in on, quite often during airstrikes, they would send surface ships in as a diversion or to actually bombard targets ashore. The mining on the 9th of May, in particular, there were, I believe, a cruiser and several destroyers that went close to the Dosan Peninsula and provided, took out anti-aircraft and other military targets on the Dosan Peninsula. So, they were striking targets, but they're also kind of divert attention from the mining operation just to the east of where they were. And that happened frequently, that the ships would go in as a diversion or for a direct attack for their own targets.
I don't think the diversion, Doctor, because they're more interested in getting hits in there, and it sure as hell
didn't. They wanted hits for sure. Yeah, they had bona fide targets to hit.
Yeah.
One of the questions you posed earlier was about the SAMs, and we had some pretty exotic equipment in the aircraft that would give us warnings when SAMs had locked up on us, and when they had fired, and when they taught us how to fight the SAM. Okay, so if SAM was coming after you, you knew you were in the crosshairs and things you could do to get away from it.
So just better training from seasoned, experienced war veterans.
Exactly, compared to my first cruise. And one of the things, you recall Hoser's Atrapa?
Oh, yeah. Jesus Christ.
Hoser's trip. You know, you had to have your humor when you're going through all this stuff. Hoser was a vigilante pilot, and he knew where all the planes in the strike group were going to be. And his favorite trick is, after coming out off a photo run in his vigilante, he would dump fuel, light the afterburner, and call Sam, Sam, Sam. And here's this vigilante coming straight at you because he knows where you are. And the next thing you know, he's rendezvousing on you, and his Hoser's Atrapa smiling at you.
He did it to me one night. Yeah, I was coming out after a strike. You weren't supposed to do this, but I take it off my oxygen mask, secured the oxygen, lit up a cigarette, and I was relaxing on the way back to the ship. And all of a sudden, boom! He comes underneath me, right, pulls up right in front of me, burning like crazy. The plane going up his tail, but zap! I said, "You son of a bitch! I'm gonna kill you!" I wanted to kill him when I got back to the ship. My heart stopped.
One of the things at night, especially at night, the Gulf of Tonkin is a pretty small area. And it was more than once, I remember going out for a night launch, and we could see the AAA from the beach going up, trying to reach the B-52s.
Oh, boy.
Okay. And here you are getting ready for a launch, knowing that you're going to be in there next. So,
yeah.
Well,
we haven't gotten to Linebacker 2 yet, but that was over
right.
Christmas of 1972. And that was the most horrific thing I've ever seen in my life. The bombers going in, all taking the same routes. SAM's
Right.
coming up, AAA coming up, planes going down, people hollering Mayday. It was just a goat rope, and it was horrible to see because you knew your buddies were getting shot down.
Exactly.
Well, these are the stories that make these programs legendary, and we're going to come back and give you an opportunity to tell some more specific ones. And I love the Hoser stories, and we heard about Hoser last week or last month in our program. But for Dr. Miralda, take us back to DC to address Admiral Zumwalt's relative inability to influence strategy and policy re the Vietnam War as CNO and as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he had made a huge and successful impact on naval operations while in Vietnam. It's quite incongruent. I think maybe you talked about relationships before, but do you have anything more to say about that?
Well, I would just elaborate that, yeah, if you think about the U.S. Navy in the River War, the Mekong Delta War, Admiral Zumwalt is the name that first comes to mind. And he had performed very well. He put together his Sea Lords campaign, which set up barriers on the Cambodian border to prevent the enemy from bringing in supplies and reinforcements. So he did very well at that time. He had a lot of things going for him, which I won't get into in detail, but he had many advantages. But then he becomes CNO. And part of the reason for that was that Secretary Melvin Laird had gone to Vietnam and was very much impressed with the briefing that Admiral Zumwalt had given. And he said to all those around him, this guy's going to be the next CNO. So that happened. That came to pass. Admiral Zumwalt jumped over the heads of 33 other flag officers to become CNO. And that didn't set right with those who got passed over, obviously. And one of the major criticisms was that he was not prepared for the job yet. He didn't command the 7th Fleet or the 6th Fleet or Pacific Fleet, really no major commands other than the one in Vietnam. And the Admiral Moore was the complete opposite. He had commanded everything, and he had worked his way up the chain of command. It's overdone that there was animosity between Admiral Moore and Admiral Zumwalt. They had differences at various times, but they also got along. They were both very much supportive of preparing the U.S. Navy for the Soviet Navy threat. They were on board either on the job and then in retirement. So that's overplayed that there was animosity. They got along when they had to. But anyway, Admiral Zumwalt comes in the CNO. He's a member of the Joint Chiefs. Well, as I mentioned earlier, Nixon really didn't have any use for the Joint Chiefs. And even prior to Nixon's time in office, President Johnson and McNamara didn't have any use for the Joint Chiefs either. So he's in a position where no one is really listening to it. The president is listening to Tom Moore. And the fact that Secretary of Defense Laird had helped Zumwalt get the job did not enamor him to the president. So he ends up, he wanted to take part in strategic and policy decisions and discussions, but none of the Joint Chiefs were really having much of an impact there. So he found himself stymied. And then he had various other contretemps with the president over the social policies in the Navy, making things better for African Americans and women and Navy sailors in general. His policies, which in hindsight, it was good that he started that. Somebody did that, and Admiral Holloway followed on with many similar programs. But President Nixon was not enamored with those progressive activities that were taking place in the Navy. To give Admiral Zumwalt credit for some of the things that were happening during that time, the country itself was going through a lot of turmoil with race riots in all the cities. You had anti-war demonstration, anti-military sentiment. A lot of negative things were coursing through the American body politic, and it impacted on the Navy as well. So Zumwalt and Holloway had to deal with both of those issues.
Thank you for that. Admiral Smith or BJ, do you have anything to contribute to what Dr. Miralda said?
Well, I can sure tell you that Admiral Zumwalt had a tough job ahead of him. Buddy and I were right there in the middle of the race riots and the race animosity. We got along famously. I remember when they said, the only time that you and I are going to be seen as equals when we walk in the room, and you'll be 1 inch shorter and taller than me. He had to just stand a little taller to get there, but we would be about the same size. But we were great friends. We saw some of the nastiest stuff that you can imagine. And it was just hard to get. It was not fathomable. And you're talking to a guy who comes from Alabama and was raised amongst a lot of black people that love him. But it's a different ballgame. Buddy used to tell me, unless you've been there, you don't understand. And he is absolutely right.
It was
BJ, any thoughts?
Yeah, on some of the carriers, I have an associate, Charlie Tompkins, who was on the Constellation, and they got ready to deploy, going to Westpac, and the CEO of the ship, for whatever reason, took all the African Americans, all the black sailors off the ship, put them on the pier in San Diego, and said, Lieutenant Tompkins, you're the ONC. Handle this, and the ship sailed off without a black sailor on the ship.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, just to bring to the attention of our audience, is very sophisticated audience, and I've got some great questions coming up about their thoughts. But one of our dear friends and a friend of mine is a Dr. John Sherwood, who wrote a classic book called Black Sailor, White Navy, and it chronicles all these things, including what you just mentioned. And it's a must read as well, to just really get a feel for what Admiral Zumwalt was going through and all Navy leadership at that time. I want to segue, though, if you don't mind. So in the pre-recorded session that Dr. Miralda talked to us about, the audience has kind of clamored around this. And for starters, what's different between early in the war and the Easter offensive, other than the kind of the gloves off? But there were some specific things that came to mind. The establishment of Top Gun. We have had a second Saturday program with the first OIC of Top Gun, Don Pedersen. The other was the notion of PIRAS, the capability, which was the positive identification of positive identification radar advisory zone. So fundamentally, they were watching MiGs take off in flight. They were tracking them early. They were elucidating their positions to the right people so that the aircraft in flight knew they were coming, where they were, what they represented. And this is really where you start thinking about the heroics of some of our fine enlisted. So a radar man, senior chief was mentioned early, Larry Ace Nowell, who got a Distinguished Service Medal from his service on the USS Chicago, because his cueing and indications and warnings in that ended up in many successful kills and other tracking excellence. But he comes to mind. But then precision-guided munitions. And Admiral Smith will talk about the walleye, and the Air Force had a lot of use for laser-guided content missiles. And we're allowing us to now take out some bridges with some more sophisticated munitions. And so there were a lot of those factors that played. Can you discuss those? And let's start with the Warriors, Snuffy and BJ, and then come back to Ed for the closing on that question. But this is a collection of thoughts from our audience. Again, very sophisticated.
Well, first of all, in any battle, any combat, the more you know and the more real time it is, the better you're off. The more happy you are to succeed. So all those things that you mentioned was information that was real time and helped you in making decisions, sometimes life and death decisions. The precision-guided munitions, we didn't use a lot of laser-guided bombs, but I used a bullpup missile, which was that wasn't exactly a lot of fun because you fired it and they had to stay with it and guide it on the way in, and all I had to do was shoot back up into the missile and they got you. That happened to me. The walleye was much better. It was a TV-guided bomb. You locked on the contrast, and in the cockpit you had a radar scope, and on that radar scope was a picture that the TV was looking at, and you could slew the lock-on box over the target, over the contrast, and lock it on, and you let it sit there for about 2 or 3 seconds, which sometimes seemed like an eternity. Yeah. and then you release it, and the bomb would follow that right down to impact, right where you shot. Certainly, it was standoff as well. You could drop that thing about 10,000 feet, you'd be pretty far away from the target. But it just made a big difference to us.
The Prowler at the time did not have any armament to carry. They do now. Well, the fact the Prowler's gone is the thing that's been replaced by the Growler. And to show the importance of what's going on in Ukraine, we sent 6 Growlers into Ukraine last month, which is an indication of the capability. Talking about the sailors, as I recall, and this is terrible, I should remember his name, the gent that was in POW, helped develop the TAP code. This is an age moment.
We're both the same.
Yeah, right. But this young man was out on the deck of a ship and went overboard and got captured and ended up in the Hilton.
Hegdahl. Douglas Hegdahl.
What was his name?
Douglas Hegdahl.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A true hero.
Yeah, he if those of you who don't remember, Hegdahl played like he was crazy. And he was going around mumbling, and North Vietnamese actually thought he was crazy. What he was doing was memorizing the names, the social security numbers, and information about every single POW. And they let him go because he was crazy. And he came back and he unloaded on naval intelligence, and we got all kinds of information.
After Jane Fonda.
Crazy like a fox.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Dr. Marolda, you want to jump in on this question?
Just going to the discussion about the difference between Linebacker and the earlier period Rolling Thunder. One of the things at the macro level was Lyndon Johnson and Secretary McNamara were very much concerned about bringing on Chinese intervention. I believe it was an accurate fear. The Chinese had made all kinds of assurances to the North Vietnamese that if the United States launched an amphibious operation or tried to topple the government, that would be the trigger for them. I'm convinced of that at this point, having read all kinds of Chinese language material and other documents. But what happened in '72 was you didn't have that fear. First of all, the Chinese did not want to go south with the new relationship with the United States. Nixon and Kissinger going to Beijing in February of '72. Same thing with the Soviets. They were more interested in strategic arms limitation negotiations than helping the North Vietnam. So we had a window of opportunity. We could do things much more robustly in '72 than we could earlier. One good example, I think, is the use of Talos surface-to-air missiles from our ships. We shot a few off during Rolling Thunder, but Johnson and McNamara were scared to death that we're going to shoot down a Soviet plane over Hanoi, so they limited the use of the Talos. Well, on the 9th of May, when we seeded the harbor of Haiphong with mines, we had Chicago offshore, not that far away, and 3 MiGs came out to attack the mine layers. The Talos took down one of them. The other 2 turned tail and went back. So that was, use of Talos right over Hanoi, right over Haiphong, a difference from what had happened before.
Yes, sir. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions, and they're very important questions. We got one from a friend from Germany, George Schimmelfennig, and his question, and I've got a second one that'll relate to it, so wait on it. The mining and bombing were not new ideas. If they had been adopted earlier, could the war have been won? And then Dave Face Kennedy, a friend, but he's also the editor of Wings of Gold from the Naval Aviation Association, also likens, the delay, in a manner of speaking, of really getting serious about, when we engaged in all of these aggressive acts, to Grant's strategic plan, which also systematically isolated the South and which ultimately ended the war. And both their questions are, why was it not done in 68 versus 72, or why wasn't it done in 65 versus 72? And of course, Ed, you just said that, LBJ, and Caro covers this in all of his books about LBJ, that he was in deep fear that there would be there's this invisible line in the sand that if you cross it, nuclear war would break out or whatever. But, what are your thoughts about this in the geopolitical sense from your views? And of course, the thing that's different maybe in a minor sense to Snuffy and BJ's view are the human factor, that they lost so many dear friends. But I'm going to let them start that, and I'll give you the finishing coda on that, Dr. Miralda. Go ahead, guys.
Buddy's much more politically astute than I am. I'm probably the most unpolitically astute admiral that's ever lived in the United States.
Why we love him.
And I proved it time again in Bosnia. But the bottom line is, nobody can really know what would have happened. And it was just, we were putting people's lives on the line and not protecting them, not giving them, it's just crazy. We were giving the enemy an opportunity to take actions against us. Let me give you an example. There was a 30-mile ring around Hanoi, and you could not attack anything inside that ring, even a SAM site. Now, the SAM site, if the SAM site fired on you, you could attack it. Well, I was on a mission with 4 A4s one time, the second cruise over there, and we were climbing up to that target, and they fired a couple of SAMs at us out of that 30-mile ring. Well, we didn't, by the time we realized that, we'd already rolled in and dropping our weapons. So we come back to the ship, and during a debrief, the chief of staff to the admiral was in on a debrief, and he said, "Do you know where those SAMs came from?" Well, yes, sir, we know about where they were. But would you load up or go in and see if you can get them fire at you again, and then you can attack them? I said, "Sir, would you like to find the back seat?" And that conversation stopped right there. They actually tried to get me to do the same thing in Bosnia. Go over there and get them to shoot at you, and then you can attack them. I said, "Bullshit! I'm not going to do that."
And this is hearsay now, but before every mission, we used to have a primary, secondary, and a tertiary target. And if the primary target was going to get you killed, it became, it went off the list. So I've heard. You have to be smart about these things too. And I had a friend on another ship that they went to the squadron CO, and his BN went to this primary target knowing they wouldn't make it back. And they lost him.
Yep. Clearly targets over there were first of all, the value of the target was mostly surface. It didn't really hurt the North Vietnamese first.
Right.
But the number of people lost was just unbelievable trying to take out some of those stupid targets.
And again, they were not talking to the aviators to find out the targets, the real targets, the hard targets, the threats. This was being done.
I believe the former Air Force Chief of Staff, Pete Piotrowski, wrote a book about McNamara and the fact that we were telling the North Vietnamese which targets we were going to hit.
Right.
And we told them so they could clear people out and we wouldn't have a bunch of civilian casualties. But they could also move weapons in. And they did. There was a bridge at Ninh Binh. And we used to Dr. Pepper strikes 10, 2, and 4. We go 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
And boy, after that third time, we just got hammered.
Yeah.
We knew where we were coming.
Yes, sir. Ed, do you want to just give a real short
Actually,
pile-on?
the fear of Chinese intervention was true enough, but there were a lot of things that could have been done at the operational level that would not have triggered a Chinese intervention. McNamara and the President Johnson just didn't trust the military, and they didn't go to say, well, what do you think is the way to do this? They tried to prejudge an operation. For instance, at one point, the naval gunfire ships said, hey, we've got these enemy boats coming down the coast. We want to take them out. And they said, no, you can't do that. Wait till they head into a river. I mean, stupid stuff like that. It could have been executed a lot better than it was. And if given the operators more latitude to carry out what they knew would be effective and safe operation or safer operations, but they didn't do that. They just tried to second guess. And the difference between 65, 68, and 72 was in 72, you had China and Russia kind of backing away from supporting North Vietnam. So we had a window of opportunity. But we weren't out to win the war in 1972. We were out to get out of Vietnam. It was to just, to get the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table so we could get the hell out. And I mean, that's the long and short of it. We accomplished that mission. We got out. And of course, the North Vietnamese carried out the whole thing in 75 and took it over. So,
well, I used the metaphor of a head scratcher earlier, but one of the comments that you made in our pre-recorded session, which just rings horrific to most of us viewers, is that from 0859 or 0856 to 0901 on 9 May, 7 A7, 6 A6s from the Coral Sea dropped 36 mines in the sea approach to Haiphong, and it fundamentally locked everybody in, couldn't get out, prevented anybody from bringing any logistic support, and it just absolutely then made the approach from China the new target set, and this is the one that is the head scratcher to everybody that's listening to the show right now. Any brief comments on that, and then we've got a ton of questions with just 10 minutes to go.
You could have argued that the mining in 65 through 68 might not have triggered Chinese intervention. I think if it had been done quickly and overnight, and that's how it was done in 72. A quick operation took only a few minutes. We could have seeded all the ports and then waited for the response, which, again, I don't think that would have triggered a Chinese intervention. Johnson and McNamara weren't willing to take that risk.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm going to talk about logistics support in a minute, but I want to just ask a couple questions. Snuffy and BJ, what was the attitude of the pilots when the gloves did come off in the later stages? And please, Snuffy, you told a sea story that I think the audience would love to hear about your final mission, the rice bag mission, shooting rice bags. Can you talk a little bit about that in a sea story sense, if you don't mind?
Yeah, well, towards the end of the war, in January, the Haiphong had been pretty much closed off. There were merchant ships who were dropping rice bags offshore, and let the tide carry them into the beach, and into the Vietnamese would pick them up from the beach. So stupidly, our mission was to fly in between the ship and the shore and shoot the rice bags. That was, I mean, the dumbest thing in SAM envelopes, be down here straight in rice bags, for God's sakes. Now, my last mission, so I think it was the 27th or 28th, I don't remember the exact date. I took off in the morning. As soon as I got airborne, I heard a Mayday call. And my mission was to go shoot rice bags. The Mayday call was the last shoot down we had occurred. It was in the DMZ. Harley Hall and his backseat of Rio. They had been shot down. I didn't know who was Harley Hall at the time. But I went down as a rescue captain. Immediately took a head rock eye. There were two OV Broncos below me circling. And one of them said, I'll roll in and mark their position with white phosphorus and let you know where they are. He rolled in, he got shot down. So now we got the F4 and we got the Bronco on the ground. I was talking to the Rio on the radio, and he said, I'm on the bank of the river. I'm going to throw my radio in the river. They're going to capture me. And so I said, if you could take cover, I've got rock, I'll drop and it'll kill a lot of people. You might want to take cover. He said, don't do that. I'm going to throw my radio way down. He did, and he was captured. I was so damn mad. The last day of the war, you get these guys, and I think they were probably executed.
They were executed. They were executed.
Yeah.
And Harley was a Blue Angel.
Yeah.
He was a former Blue Angel.
Leader.
Yeah. And I was up there at the same time, and they were executed. Didn't have to happen.
There's a lot of comments, emotional comments from our audience. I'm not going to mention names, but I grew up in San Clemente, California, and why do you care where I grew up? But President Nixon's summer home was in San Clemente, and so we were hyper vigilant about his promises and the direction of what he wanted to do vis-a-vis the war. Like he had a secret plan which would end the war if you voted for him over Humphrey in '68. And simply put, and I remember being in audiences in school where he was at the podium, and classmates of mine, more brave than me, were asking him, hey, the secret plan, when is it going to come into effect, and things of this nature, because we did care. And of course, we're located on the northern gate, Camp San Mateo, Camp San Onofre, Bassalon Road, all of that of Camp Pendleton. So many of my cohorts were Marine dependent young people, but I just share this not as a question, but as an audience response to this Easter offensive. What took so long? Why didn't we do this sooner? What were you thinking? Senior leadership, not military, but political. So, but let me segue, and I just did that to represent their views. There's a couple of questions vis-a-vis what are your thoughts on comparing Vietnam and what's going on in the Ukraine? And one of my former shipmates, Doug Watson, Auburn, Alabama man. I don't know who you favored, Snuffy, whether you were a Crimson guy or a War Eagle, but he's a War Eagle. He was on the Bruton. But his question is, what are the parallels that, or are there any, between what we saw in Vietnam and what we see in the Ukraine? And I'll throw it over to you two first.
First of all, I feel sorry for anybody who went to Auburn. Mobile, I'd say we go north, you smell it, turn left, you step in it, and you're at Auburn. So,
okay, did you get that, Doug? Okay.
My sister went to Auburn. I've never spoken to her since. But anyway, the similarities are we're afraid. Putin's a crazy man. He'll tell what he's going to do. Yeah. We've got to treat him with respect in the sense that he's got a weapon that can destroy the world if he wants to. But we used to have this policy of mutually assured self-destruction, and it worked. But then we had somebody in Russia that was a little bit more sane than I think Putin would be. It's right to be concerned about Putin, what Putin's going to do. And we ought to go the max to help the Ukrainians. They're doing such a wonderful job to protect themselves, but that place is just decimated.
Crazy.
That's a great response, and we appreciate that thought leadership on that. BJ, do you concur, or do you have a slightly different view of that?
Sure. In fact, even going back to War Eagles, my right seater, Ron Higdon, was a War Damn Eagle. and we flew together during Vietnam, the second cruise in the Prowlers, and could have had a better person. But what's going on is hard to fathom.
Right, I understand. Real briefly, Ed, anything to put a coat on that one?
No, I would just say that, of course, all wars, all times are different. And who knows how it's going to turn out in Ukraine. But I think I see similarities when you've got a populace that really is united in resisting a foreign invader. It's a tough thing for that invader to make it. They may beat up initially, but it's tough to make it stick. I don't see how they're going to quote, pacify Ukraine, whatever they do. I mean, they're bludgeoning the country right now, but the people are still alive and they're being in opposition. Same thing in Vietnam. You had a lot of the population in South Vietnam who wanted to be part of Vietnam altogether with North Vietnam. And the other thing is sanctuaries. They had sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos and in North Vietnam during the war. And it's the same thing now. The Ukrainians have Western Europe, the NATO countries, and we have access to them through Lviv and other places where the supplies can keep coming in. How are the Russians going to cut off that incoming supply? So I see those similarities there, but every war is different. So,
well, thank you for those comments. I want to, as one of our last questions, it's not the last question, but logistics support. I do not believe we can underscore when you fire 88,000 rounds of VT frag. Where did the bullets come from? Well, they came from AEs, and a dear friend of our foundation and me personally is Captain Larry Chambers, who at the time, or he's a rear admiral retired, but at the time was captain and CO of the White Plains, the Orient Express, AFS-4. And he told the story to me many times, and this goes back 35 or more years, about the demanding op tempo of his ship and that of his sister ships, because they would have to bring beans, bullets, black oil to the fleet in real time, sometimes being alongside 7-8 hours at a time, and that's just one grouping of ships. And then they would have to roll back and rearm and refuel and all these things themselves, and it was a killer pace. But any comments or any stories about the magnificence of those people and their efforts in this campaign?
Well, I was the CO of the USS Kalamazoo, which was a great order, AOR-7. We did a hell of a lot of work over the Mediterranean and around the Atlantic. That's another advantage of sea power. You can replenish from sea while underway in relatively safe areas. You can go out deeper, get rid of landmass, but you don't have to worry about roads, railroads, airports. You just replenish and go out again. And we would have not survived. The sea power would not have been able to show nearly the depth of its capabilities without those AORs and AEs and AFSs.
You don't realize how important. You really don't realize how important they are, and it takes time to even understand that. It took me until the cruise after Vietnam to really to comprehend all the work that was being done.
I was on the strategic studies group after I had the command of the America, and I remember thinking after about 6 months up there, Navy does not do strategic planning that well. With the CEO of the carrier, I said, look, I told the supply officer, we're going to go on a cruise, make sure we got beans, bullets, and food. That's all. So he gets sort of served on, and this is where we're going to be, this is what we need. We didn't have to do it. There was not a whole lot of planning for logistics. It was just there. It made it easy for us.
Because these supply officers are on top of they call them supply officers for a reason. They are on top of their game.
You got it.
And only the best and brightest are out there, and they take such good care of you. You don't even realize it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I had dinner last night with retired Rear Admiral Supply Officer Vince Griffith, and then Basil Gray, and the stories they told that we have no exposure to. They were talking about how you purchase fuel and all the intricacies of this. It's an amazing business, isn't it?
And it's always there for you. Always there.
It really is. Dr. Miralda, you talked about it and certainly mentioned it in your book to some extent. Any thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I would like to elaborate on what has been said, and I completely agree with what's been said. I talked about in the video Task Force 73, which was the logistic support force for the 7th Fleet. But the entire logistic effort in support of the war in Vietnam was phenomenal. 10 years across 7,000 miles of ocean, and anywhere from 95 to 97% of all the fuel, ammo, construction equipment, heavy equipment, and even earlier in the war, troops went by sea. The Navy's Military Sealift Command did a phenomenal job to fight a war on a continent 7,000 miles away for 10 years and keep it going. Is just amazing that we could do that. We did it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And again, Dr. Marolda's book, Admirals Under Fire, the U.S. Navy in the Vietnam War. It's one for the ages. And if you've never heard of Harry Don Felt, a very important guy, and if he had just stayed in command, he knew how to speak truth to power. He would have been fired ultimately. But for 6 years, he was PACOM, and he held the Army and our Navy in check from getting too involved in that war. So I want to send it back to not so much to you, Dr. Marolda. I think we've got your sense on all these things. But what are your last reflections? What do you want to tell history, Snuffy and BJ? What would you like to say to those out there to kind of put a view on this this whole Easter offensive and anything you want to say as Golden Eagles and we all value immensely and you honor us with your presence. But what are your last reflections before we get into the closing sequence?
Well, from a personal standpoint, my entire career, I've written on other topics of naval history, but the Vietnam War has been my primary interest. I'm a Vietnam veteran myself. I served, I should probably not say this, but I was in the Army and 1 year in Vietnam. And I feel that we were all brothers and sisters over there fighting for a cause that we believed in, and we gave our all. Some gave the ultimate all for that service to the country. It was honorable service, and I think we should all be proud of that. We and the others all gave our best, and didn't work out, but we were doing it for the right moral principles.
Thank you, sir. Snuffy.
My advice to any military man is tell the politicians exactly what you think, because they don't know our business. They don't speak our language. They don't understand the efforts that we have to put forward to carry out their wishes. So if you're not honest with the politicians, like the Admirals Under Fire, which was a magnificent book, you don't deserve to be in command of anything. You got to tell it like it is, whether it hurts or not. You got to be upfront. Now, don't get in a war you don't intend to win. Period.
Yes, sir. BJ.
You need reality checks, and you get that from the warriors. Without question, you get that from the warriors. And once you go out there, you need a full team. You need everyone pulling the same way. And some of the problems we had in the early 70s, the discourse with the carriers, the riots and everything, I think it tore the ships apart.
It did.
Okay, it tore the ships apart. They couldn't. How can you do your mission if you don't have 110% participation? Everyone going for the same target, striving for the same target. You'll never make it. You'll never be successful. And that's a relationship you have to have. And you don't know who's going to bail your butt out of it. If you get in trouble, you do not know who's going to bail you out. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who it is. If they're there to save you, that's what you need. And I know that's the relationship Snuffy and I have. In fact, when I was coming along in the Navy, three things Roberta reminded me of. Quite often we would have a day off, and I think when you were at Miramar, you were the only CO that invited me to his house for drinks and dinner. And we reciprocated here. It's just the way you are. You treat people the way you want to be treated.
Exactly.
And that's the good thing. Snuffy was a 4-star, as high as you can go in the military. And that's the way he is with everyone. Right now today. He hasn't changed. That's why we all love him.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank Dottie and Loretta, your spouses, for their contributions to your great recollections and reflections from your time in this critical period of the war. Speaking as a baby boomer, the Vietnam War was really the most significant and poignant event of our lives, as it devoured President Johnson's otherwise strong legacy, produced civil unrest, created a horrific scenario in the '68 Democratic Presidential Convention, and set the stage for every event, even perhaps including Watergate. The nation's cynicism, and that's a word that came across from the audience several times in this very session, has never dimmed since in our collective lifetimes. As we leave this important topic, let us remember the brave warriors who gave their lives in this war, and those whose heroics, such as our panelists today, reflected valiantly on the course of our Navy into the last phases of the Cold War, into our future. Ironically, Secretary Penn and Admiral Smith came to us today from the Lansdowne Resort in Leesburg, as they might have mentioned earlier, where they're attending a reunion of the Golden Eagles, along with other heroes from that era to the present. And I think it was mentioned that 50% of the attendees at this Golden Eagles reunion are Vietnam era veterans. Thank you also to Dr. Marolda, whose evidence-based approach to telling these stories keep us mindful of how it really happened, hopefully inspiring military and political leaders to make better informed decisions in the future. If you enjoyed our program today, please hit like and subscribe and ring the bell, and also consider joining our foundation at www.navyhistory.org. Many thanks again to our speakers, and many thanks to our producer, Colin Masso, whose graphics and original music really enhanced Dr. Marolda's remarks. Join us next month, and just simply join us. Thank you for being here today, and have a great day. Out here.